So welcome to the weekly Torah Perspective Shir, hosted by the man known as the Shim. This week, Parshas Shemos, we are confronted with the Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, who settled in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, as we have heard in the last two Sedris. And immediately the Parsha kicks off with Ve'ele Shemos Bnei Yisrael Haboim Mitzrayim. These are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. And the question is, what does Israel mean in this context? Does it refer to Yaakov Avinu? Or does it refer to what we call today the Bnei Yisrael, the nation of Israel? I think we have to say it's the former. It's the children of Yaakov who was called Israel. Because we were not yet a nation at that time. 70 people came to Mitzrayim. The truth is, there were probably much more than 70 because there were their servants and their entourage. It's probably a few hundred people who came. But Ish uveso, a man and his house, or every man with his household came. There were 3 points in our history where we made the transition from one situation as a nation to another situation. This is the first, from a tribe to the germ of a peoplehood. This happened in Mitzrayim, in Egypt. There was a second time that we made a transition, and that was after the Babylonian exile, after the Golus Bovel, where we became from dispossessed exiles. We returned to Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel, equipped with the book. Tanakh took shape in those days because they were able, during the exile, to evaluate what should be preserved for generations to come. The last 3 of our Nevi'im, Zechariah, Haggai, and Malachi, lived in those days. And of course, the book of Esther came from the time of the exile. And those books were added to our canon. We became a people with a book, or with a collection of books. And there's a third time that we made a transition, and that is when we returned from the diaspora, the worldwide dispersion of the Jewish people, to create a modern nation state in the land of Israel. The only transition that was actually complete was the first one. Yetzias Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt, was a complete, we left Egypt, we left no one behind. There is, of course, a medrash that actually we did leave people behind, but that they did not survive. What do we mean by this? Well, we read in Parshas Beshalach, Chamushim olu bnei Yisrael mi Mitzrayim. They went chamushim, and chamushim can be understood as 1/5, meaning 4/5 or an 80% of our nation stayed behind. Whether that is to be taken literally or not, nevertheless, it's an interesting thought to consider that even then, not everyone left. But those who stayed behind did not survive as Jews. Whereas in the other 2 transitions, the great majority of the Jewish people never returned from Babel, never returned from the Babylonian exile. And it was only, I think, 42,000 Jews returned with Ezra and Nehemiah, with that return from the Babylonian exile. And the community in Babel, in Babylonia, remained for a long time the center of Jewish learning, where the land of Israel actually took a second place compared to the great academies of Babel, of Babylonia. That's where the Talmud was created, and the Talmud Yerushalmi never took that place of authority that the Talmud Bavli, that the Babylonian Talmud has. Be that as it may, what were we known as when we were in Mitzrayim, in that period that we grew from a tribe to the germ of a nation? There's one word that is associated with the Jews in Egypt, and it is the word Ivri, the Hebrews. Moshe Rabbeinu used the term Ivrim, the Hebrews, when he spoke to Pharaoh. He said, "Thus speaks Hashem, the God of the Ivrim." We have to consider this name, Ivri. It is from a root, avar, which means the other side. And one interpretation is it's the people who stand on the other side of some divide. The first person to be called an Ivri is actually Avraham Avinu, our ancestor Abraham. In his interaction with the world around him, he is called Ivri. An example is when he got the message that his nephew Lot had been abducted in the period of the War of the Kings, that famous episode that is described in Bereshis in the 14th perek, 14th chapter. It says there, "Vayovar hapolit vayaged leAvram ha'ivri." A fugitive came and reported to Avram the Ivri. Abraham was called an Ivri. Later on, also in Sefer Bereshis, Yosef, when he was employed in the house of Potiphar, who bought him as a slave, he is called an Ish Ivri. Mrs. Potiphar, who tried to seduce him, called him an Ivri. It says there in chapter 39, verse 14, in Bereshis Perek Lamed Tes, Posuk Yud Dalet, it says, "Vatikro la'anshei veiso v'tamer lohem leimar ru'u hevi lonu ish ivri letzachek bana." She called the people of her household, and she, of course, reversed the roles. It was she who tried to seduce Joseph, but she claimed that it was Joseph who had assaulted her indecently. And she said, "Ru'u hevi lonu ish ivri." He, my husband, has brought in our house an ish ivri, a Hebrew man. Equally, when Joseph was in prison for this, as a result of this false accusation, and he had the encounter with the chief butler and the chief baker, he explained the butler's dream, which was very positive, which announced that he would be restored to his former position. And then Joseph said to the chief baker, to the chief butler, "When you come back to your former station, please remember me, because gunavti me'eretz Ivrim. I have been stolen from the land of the Ivrim, of the Hebrews." And indeed, when the chief butler is restored to his former position and he reports to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh needs help with his recurring dreams, then the chief butler remembered that he met in prison this young lad, and he says, "V'shom itonu na'ar ivri." There with us was a na'ar ivri, a Hebrew lad. We see so recurring in the whole Joseph story that when others outside the circle of the children of Israel refer to us, they refer to us Ivrim, Hebrews. Of course, in most languages today, we are called Jews. In Russian, we are called Hebrews, Yevrei. In Polish, we're called Żyd. In Russia, Żyd is a very pejorative term for Jew, but in Polish, it's simply the name for Jew. In this country, we have the Union of Orthodox Hebrew Congregations. They call themselves Hebrews. Actually, not a very good term to use, because it's the term that the non-Jewish world used in relation to us. There's one other name that they use, and it is Jew. You find this, for example, in the Megillah. In the Megillah, it's always talking about Hayehudim, Hayehudim, Hayehudim. The Netziv actually is of the opinion that the Megillah was written by Persians. It was not written by Jews. And it was written from the point of view of the non-Jewish world looking at us. And that is how he explains that the name of Hashem is not mentioned in the Megillah. There's one thing that I still wanted to say, and it's when it comes to the midwives in this week's Sabbath. These two midwives, by the names of Shifra and Pur, are called Hameyaledos HaIvrios, the Hebrew midwives. We have to be very careful with this term midwives, because it is just inconceivable that there were two midwives for the thousands and tens of thousands of pregnant Jewish women. It's just not, it cannot be done that way. The logical explanation is that these two women were in charge of the midwifery among the Jewish slaves, among the Hebrew slaves. And they were under the authority of Paro. They were pharaonic officers of health of some sort. And actually you can see this in their names, Shifra and Pur. Shifra is spelled Shin Pe Resh He, and Pur is spelled Pe Vav Ayin He. And it's interesting that the name Pharaoh, Paroi, is right in their name. Shifra, the middle two letters are Pe Resh, and the last two letters of Pur are Ayin He. Pe Resh Ayin He, Pharaoh. Moshe Rabbeinu grew up as the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. He was, for all intents and purposes, a member of the Egyptian royal family. And he had a very protected, shielded childhood. The Medrash has stories about him playing with the crown of his grandfather, his adopted grandfather, Pharaoh. But what is being conveyed to us is that Moshe Rabbeinu was an Egyptian by education, by upbringing, and it is very, very difficult to even imagine what kind of early life Moshe Rabbeinu had in the light of the fact that later on he became the Prince of Prophets, the leader of the Jewish people. In fact, in practical sense, the king, the first king that we've had. It starts with Vayihi Bayomim Hohem Vayigdal Moshe. It happened in those days that Moshe grew up, Vayetzei El Echov, and he went out to his brethren, Vayar Besivlo Som, and he saw their suffering, Vayar Ish Mitzri Makei Ish Ivri, and he saw an Egyptian man hitting a Hebrew man, Mei Echov, one of his brothers. Let's analyze this pasuk for a moment. In the first place, Vayetzei El Echov, he left the palace, driven by some kind of urge to see what is going on with the Hebrew slaves. He still saw, when he saw the Egyptian overseer or the Egyptian officer hitting the Jew, he still saw this Jew not as Echot mi bnei Yisrael, one of the children of Israel. No, he saw him as an Ish Ivri, because that's how he grew up to see them, as Ivrim. We see also twice the word Vayar, and he saw. It says Vayar besifla som, and then Vayar Ish Mitzri Make Ish Ivri. Why does the pasuk have to say twice Vayar, he saw? Usually Vayar besifla som is translated as he looked on their suffering. But I want to understand it in a slightly different way. Vayar besifla som. Be, the base, the preposition base, can mean in, can mean on. It can also mean by means of. Besivlasom, through their suffering, Vayar, he was able to see. In other words, witnessing what was going on there awakened in Moshe Rabbeinu an awareness. And now we understand better two other words, two other terms that are used in this verse. It says, Vayetze el Echov, towards his brethren he went out, and the Ish Ivri, the Hebrew man, is called Ish Ivri Me Echov, away from his brethren. There must have been an awareness in him that he is, in fact, one of the Bnei Israel. We see that later confirmed. We'll come to that. On the other hand, he's an Egyptian. He really is an Egyptian. And he sees the Jews as Ivrim. So we have El Echov and Me Echov in tension with each other in one pasuk. So this is a moment of awakening for this young prince. And through their suffering, he was able to see an Egyptian man and a Hebrew man. Not only the scene that played out there in the building site where these Hebrew slaves were building, but also in Moshe Rabbeinu. There was an Ish Mitzri and an Ish Ivri. When he saw this, the next verse, the next pasuk says, Vayifen kal, and he looked hither and thither, he looked both ways. Vayaki ein ish, and he saw that there was no one there. Vayach es ha-Mitzri, and he killed the Mitzri, or he smote the Mitzri. Vayit benehu bachal, and he buried them in the sand. I heard years ago from the late Rabbi Isaac Bernstein in his Monday night shir, Vayifen kal v'chal, vayaki ein ish. What do you mean, ein ish? There was no ish. The previous pasuk says, Vayar ish mitzri make ish ivri me'achov. Twice the word ish is mentioned. And then the next pasuk says there is ein ish. There were definitely people there. Vayaki ein ish. He saw, said Rabbi Bernstein, that having an Egyptian inside me and a Jew inside me, I cannot be an ish. I cannot be a man. Vayifen kal v'chal. He looked at the Egyptian side in himself. He looked at the Jewish side in himself, and he decided, ki ein ish. There is not a man here. Vayach es ha-Mitzri, and he killed the Mitzri. Not just the Mitzri outside himself, the Mitzri in himself. This, of course, led to Moshe having to flee Egypt. And now, in one single pasuk, Vayishma Paro es hadover hazeh. Paro got wind of what had happened, that Egyptian prince had killed the Egyptian overseer and apparently had discovered some kind of kinship with the Hebrew slaves. Vayevakesh la'arok es Moshe, and he attempted to kill Moshe. Yivrach Moshe mipnei Pharaoh, and Moshe fled because of Paro. Vayeshev be'eretz Midian, and he settled in the land of Midian. Vayeshev ala be'er, and he sat near the well. What happens in one single pasuk? One moment he is in the palace of Paro. This end of the pasuk, he's already sitting at the be'er, at the well in Midian. And whom does he meet there? He meets there the daughters of his future father-in-law Yisro, and they invite him in, and he started to work for Yisro, and he married Yisro's daughter Tzipora, and then God appeared to him in a burning bush, and then he went back to Mitzrayim. In the meantime, he had two sons, Gershom and Eliezer, and he put the sons on a donkey, and he went to Mitzrayim. He was 80 years old by then. When he fled from Paro's palace, he must have been like 20 years old. There's a gap of 60 years that's going on here. And that gap of 60 years is actually filled in by some midrashim, obscure midrashim, not very often quoted. That Moshe Rabbeinu actually lived for some 40 years, or maybe even longer, in Cush, in Ethiopia. And there was a king over some kind of Ethiopian tribe. Not terribly important, apparently, because we don't emphasize this so often. It's as if in his exile away from the Egyptian royal family, he could make use of his upbringing as a young prince where he had learned statecraft or something like that, that he could make a career as a king in Kush. The point that I want to mention is that this encounter in Midian led to the marriage with Zipporah, and she had children, and they were still young enough to be sitting on the donkey with her, on one single donkey, when Moshe Rabbeinu returned to Mitzrayim. So Moshe Rabbeinu, being 80 years old, must have met Zipporah maybe when he was 60 or 65 years old. And how do the daughters of Yisrael refer to this man whom they met at this well? There was some trouble with shepherds who made trouble for these girls, and Moshe Rabbeinu intervened and protected these girls, and then they come home and the father says, "Why are you home so early?" And they said, because he was used to the fact that the daughters had to wait until all the other shepherds had used the well before they got the chance to take water for their flock. And they said, "Vatomano ish mitzri hitzilonu." There was an Egyptian man who helped us. Moshe Rabbeinu had been away from the age of 20 until what we assume now 65 something, right? You're talking 45 years, he was still an Ish Mitzri. He looked like a Mitzri, he spoke like a Mitzri. He was still a Mitzri, despite the moment many, many years earlier when he had this confrontation with his own Jewish background, when he saw the Hebrew slaves, he was still an Egyptian. I think that the turnaround came at the Sneh. At the Sneh, at the burning bush, Hashem addressed him and he says, "Vayomer Onochi Elokei Ovicho, I am the God of your father, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov," the God of Avraham, the God of Yitzchak, and the God of Yaakov. It should have said, "Onochi Elokei Avasecho, I am the God of your fathers," when it mentions Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. No, it says, "I am the God of your father." It must refer to Amram. It must refer to Amram. It must refer to one of Moshe Rabbeinu's early memories of those crucial 2 years that he was actually in the bosom of his own family, when an awareness that children absorb when they are in those formative the first 2 years of their life, that somehow in Moshe Rabbeinu, the Jewish spirit was nurtured by his real father and by his real mother. So now Moshe Rabbeinu becomes the Moshe Rabbeinu as we know him from then on. So this is what I wanted to say about how you become from an Ivri, you become a Ben Yisrael, and how Moshe Rabbeinu from Ish Mitzri became Moshe Rabbeinu.